In this video, I'm going to show you how to build this Cinewhoop style quadcopter. This is the Donut 3. It runs 3-inch propellers, and it's got enough thrust to carry a GoPro. So what makes a Cinewhoop are the ducts, and these are the Donut 3 ducts. They're not TPU, but they're pretty well printed. We've got the Mamba F405 Mini Mark II flight controller and 4-in-1 ESC, the Foxeer Aero Micro Pro, the AKK Race VTX, the Amway Mini 2.5 antenna, and the GEP-RC SpeedX 1408 3500 kV motors. So let's put this thing together. First you want to put the screws through the arms and the base plate and secure them with the included standoffs. You don't have to get these super tight quite yet, but don't forget to tighten them later on. So now let's put the motors on here. Usually you want to put some blue Loctite on the screws to make sure they don't vibrate loose, but that's optional. Now we want to separate the flight controller from the 4-in-1 ESC so we can get to the pads there. So unscrew the nylon nuts and unplug the flight controller. Now unfortunately neither the flight controller or the frame came with M2 screws, so I had to use my little kit here. So make sure you do have some handy. Next we're going to solder the wires to the 4-in-1 ESC, but to prepare the pads you want to add a little bit of flux to make sure the solder sticks. And once you've done that you can prepare the pads for the wires. Now generally you want to cover the entire pad with a ball of solder, but since the pads are so close together here, don't make a big ball of solder because it'll just ooze over to the next pad. And finally we've got the battery lead pads. Just be careful not to tap any of the components on the board because you might accidentally melt them or damage them. Now it's a good idea to zip tie the wires to the frame here. That way all the wires are lined up properly and you can control how they flow across the arm. That's important later because you need to make sure that they don't get pinched by the ducts when you put those on. Now it's time to solder the wires. So I came in from the side here, but in retrospect, I think it might have been better to come in along the front and back of the 4-in-1 ESC and solder the wires from the inside. So you can try that. When it comes to soldering these wires, you need to be very careful when you push the iron down, not to push it down too quickly and not to let the solder flow to the next pad. I had that happen to me several times and I had to make a lot of adjustments. So this part can be pretty tedious, but you can get through it. Now it's time to add the battery lead. Put some solder into the holes of the XT30 and push your wires up in there. Cut your wires a little short on one end so you can send your battery lead out through the side and just solder them to the pads. Now for the capacitor, this is the negative side and this is the positive side. So make sure you've got the polarity correct and kind of rest it there. Cut the wires down. And just add a little bit of solder to the top of the wires and solder them right on top of the joints you already made. Take your time with this and make sure that it is fully secured. Just add a little bit of solder at a time until you've got a nice shiny ball on top of it. And then you can just trim down the excess wire. Just make sure you keep track of the wire trimmings. Don't leave them on the board. You don't want to short anything out. Next, let's add the receiver. Here we've got the FrSky XM Plus. And you want to make sure that your receiver matches your radio. So if you're flying a FlySky radio or any other type, then you're going to need a receiver that matches it. This is only for FrSky radios. Now let's put the flight controller back on, add a couple nylon nuts to hold it in place, and let's solder that receiver on there. Now these pads are really tiny, so you're going to have to be patient with this. I found the best way to go is just to put a little bit of solder on the pad, and just lightly tap the wire into the ball of solder with your iron, but don't push too hard or too quick because then the solder might ooze over to the next pad. Just be patient with it, and if you mess up, you can always add a little bit of flux to the solder to make it work better for you. So now that we've got that connected, we can bind it to our radio. And what I like to do is clamp the bind button down so I've got a free hand to connect the battery. Connect the battery and the receiver will be in bind mode. Go into bind mode on your radio and you should be bound within a couple seconds. Once the light is flashing, then you're good to go. Can unplug and remove the tweezers from the receiver and replug in and just make sure that we get the green light indicating the bind. Okay, we're good to go. So next you want to cover the receiver with a little bit of shrink tube, and I usually just half melt it so I can always pull it off later. And let's squeeze that in between the flight controller and the 4-in-1 ESC. Next, we can mount the camera and solder it to the flight controller. Usually it's a good idea to screw it into the side plates first. I use the included M2 screws that came with the camera. And pay attention to the inputs here. We do not need the voltage cable here, so let's pull this little purple one out. We can use the Betaflight OSD for voltage reading. Let's put the camera in place and measure the wires. Give yourself just a little bit of slack so that you can adjust the camera angle. And let's get this soldered up. So we've only got 3 wires here. One is the 5-volt input to power the camera as well as the ground. And then we've got the video output from the camera, which is the video input to the flight controller. Always double check the wiring diagrams to make sure that you are soldering to the correct pads. And take your time here because these pads are awfully small. Next, we've got the video transmitter. And first we want to remove a couple wires. We do not need the 5-volt output or the ground. This is typically used to power the camera. But since the flight controller is powering the camera, we don't need them. So that leaves us with 4 wires. One for the voltage in and the ground to power the VTX. And then we've got the video wire, which takes the video from the flight controller to the VTX, which sends it out to your goggles. And then we've got the OSD control wire. And this wire is used to configure your VTX through your OSD or on-screen display. And finally, before you power up anything, you want to make sure that none of these wires are touching. So it's a good idea to use your multimeter in continuity mode to make sure none of your solders are bridged. Now let's mount our receiver antennas. And typically I'll mount them off the front arms of the quad, but since these arms are straight, I couldn't get them at a 45-degree angle, so I kind of had to get a little creative here. And what I did was mount the zip ties onto the flight controller holes, and that way I was able to get them at the right angle and shrink tube the antennas to the zip ties. Finally, we've got the antenna, and you want to remove all the little bits there so you can push it through this little TPU mount. Add the little bits back so that you've got it nice and secure, and add your antenna. Snap that onto your VTX and we can start broadcasting. So the camera comes with this little joystick thing here, and you want to connect it so that you can turn off all the OSD elements. The camera has them all on by default, and we really don't need these. So what you need to do is hold the up arrow for a couple seconds until this menu comes up and turn everything off. Then hit save and you're good to go. And here's the regular menu. You can press the center button to get to this, and you can use this to adjust any of the color, contrast, or settings of the camera, but I usually use stock settings. Now, typically I don't put the props on until the very end, but they're a little hard to access with the ducts in place, so I put them on here first. It just makes it a little easier to tighten the lock nuts. Next, we can add the ducts. Make sure you've got the screw holes pointing down on the outward edge. Be careful when you slide them down because you don't want to pinch your motor wires. The ducts should sit comfortably level with the top of the standoffs, so the top plate can fit right on there flush. Screw the ducts to the arms, and let's secure the VTX. Now, it's a good idea to add some shrink tube to the VTX because you don't want it to short out against the flight controller. You're going to have to hunt down some very wide shrink tube for this, though. Now, let's secure the top plate and finish this thing off. Be sure to tighten your screws on both the top and the bottom of the standoffs so that nothing will vibrate loose. And it might even be a good idea to double check all the screws just to make sure everything is nice and tight. So here it is. Finally, you want to add some sticky pads for the battery and the camera. Now, one problem here is that we can't access the USB port very easily through this frame. But I found a little trick. I was able to squeeze my USB cable through between the ducts, and I was able to carefully kind of maneuver it into the slot, but from here you can't really push it in very firmly, so I used some tweezers to kind of get it in there. This seems to work pretty well, and I managed to get it in and out several times to make settings in the configurator. You can get a 90-degree angle USB adapter, but this works just as well. So let's get this thing ready to fly. We can stick the GoPro on there and use a battery strap to hold it in place. You need a good long battery strap, but this seems to work pretty well. It's not a very protective way to mount the camera, but as long as you fly slow and tame, you should be alright. Just don't get crazy with your maneuvers. So here it is, all ready to go. Let's weigh it. Comes in at 443 grams all up, which is not too bad. So I'll leave you with some flight footage here while I talk about the build. This was a moderately difficult build, but it's mainly due to all the small pads on the flight controller and the 4-in-1 ESC. But with enough patience, I think most people can do it. And one thing to point out is that the motors do get a little hot, but that's pretty much par for the course when it comes to these Cinewhoop builds. I tried the HQ prop Cinewhoop props, as well as the GemFam ducted props. And I found that the GemFams ran considerably cooler, so you definitely want to get those for this build. But otherwise, it flies great. I haven't had any issues. I've done several packs on it, and I'm really happy with the footage and what it can pull off. You can put a GoPro Session 5 on here and use Real Steady Go to stabilize the footage, but you're probably going to need to mount it on zip ties. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look up a couple videos on Session 5 on Real Steady Go. Otherwise, the Hero 7 works great. You can use the Hero 6 with Real Steady Go, and you can also use the Hero 5, but I think you might also need to mount that one on zip ties. Anyway, this is meant for slow, easygoing footage, and it definitely performs in that regard. It can carry a GoPro no problem, and with an 850 mAh 4S battery, I'm able to get anywhere from 3 to 4 minutes of flight time, so it's pretty efficient, and I'm really happy with how this came together. And finally, you can find the complete build guide for this on rotorbuilds.com, including a wiring diagram, photographs, and detailed instructions on how to configure this on Betaflight. So be sure to check that, as well as the part list. And if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up in the comments here or on the guide at rotorbuilds.com. And please subscribe to this channel for more FPV related content. And don't forget to drop a like. Thank you. Bye.